Hello and welcome back for another Torah Tuesday. I'm Dr. Carmen Imes, Associate Professor of Old Testament at Biola University's Talbot School of Theology. Today we are continuing our study of Exodus. We're in chapter 21. For several weeks we've been in a series treating the laws of Exodus that have to do with liability for injury or death. So beginning in chapter 21, verse 12, and running all the way to verse 27, we have examples of human versus human liabilities. So humans who cause the death or injury of other humans. And then beginning in verse 28, running to 32, we have animal versus human liabilities. We're going to finish up human versus human today and talk about animal versus human. And then next week, it'll go on to animal versus animal and human versus animal. So this today's passage also returns us to the topic of servitude in order to address the question of injury, not death, to someone who's an indentured servant. So this is going to pick up on and continue the conversation that we've been having in previous videos. I have noticed that people get very animated online and want to debate vigorously questions of whether the Bible allows slavery, endorses slavery, allows the beating of slaves, and whether God is a God who is pro-life, whether the Bible could be considered a pro-life document. Last week's video, we talked about the value of unborn life, because a pregnant woman and her child become the victims of violence. I argued that there is liability for the one who causes the injury to a woman or to her unborn child. And some of the responses I've gotten online are that, you can't say that God values unborn life because look at all the innocent children who are being attacked or killed in the Old Testament indiscriminately. These are important questions to raise, and I don't think that Facebook comments or YouTube comments are the best venue to have a robust discussion of these issues. I have attempted, when people have raised their questions in good faith, I've attempted to answer those questions if they're not just lobbing grenades at me. However, I think the best way to answer the question about whether the Bible is a pro-life document is to work through Exodus verse by verse the way we've been doing, because it gradually builds the case. It helps lay the groundwork and the foundation for understanding these other texts. So I'm going to just keep plugging along through this book, and because I truly believe that it has so much wisdom to offer us, to show us the character of God and to show us how he wants us to live. So beginning in chapter 21, I'm going to first read verses 26 and 27, and then we'll deal with the next paragraph. If a man strikes the eye of his servant or the eye of his maidservant and destroys it, he must surely set him free because of his eye. If he knocks out a tooth of his servant or his maidservant, he must surely set him free because of his tooth. Now, we have just read in the previous verse, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. So that explains why we're dealing with eyes and teeth in this passage. And as I said, it continues the topic of liabilities for human on human injury. I think it's very fascinating and important to notice that if a master causes permanent injury to his servant, whether male or female, that results in the freedom of that servant. In other words, they're released from the debt that they've been working to pay off. The debt is paid and they can go without paying anything to settle that debt. What do we learn from this? The body of a servant does not belong to their employer. Only mild corporal punishment was tolerated in Old Testament law. We see that in verses 20 and 21. If permanent injury or death are caused, there is liability for the one causing the harm. The rabbis say, and I agree, that eye and tooth are just examples. They're symbolic of any body part that would experience permanent injury. Unlike ancient Near Eastern laws from this time period, the servant status does not result in a lower valuation on life. So in these other law codes, if somebody's a servant, maybe there's a a penalty, like a fine that you have to pay instead of the death penalty. Or maybe there's a lower fine if someone is a servant than if they are a free person, free citizen. And I find it really interesting that the biblical laws do not distinguish between servants and non-servants in assigning penalties. They emphasize the humanity and the dignity of these indentured servants. And this is why, to repeat what I've said many times before, I don't think slavery is the right term to use for this category of people in ancient Israel. Now let's move on to verses 28 to 32. This is the next paragraph of the Mishpatim, or covenant scroll of Exodus. And here we're dealing with animal on human injury. So what if the injury or death caused to a human is caused by an animal, and that animal, we're not talking about wild animals here. There's nobody liable if a wild lion attacks someone. But what if an animal that's a powerful domesticated draft animal, what if that animal causes permanent injury or death to a human being? What happens then? And that's what we're looking at here. So reading from my translation from the Hebrew. If a bull or ox attacks a man or a woman and he dies, the bull must surely be stoned to death, and he must not eat its meat, but the owner of the bull is not liable. If a bull has previously attacked, and its owner has been warned, but he does not guard it, then if a man or a woman dies, the bull must be stoned, and its owner must also be put to death. If a ransom is set upon him, then he may give the payment for his life according to the full amount which was set upon him. Or, if it attacks a son or a daughter, according to this same decision, it shall be done to him. If the bull attacks a male servant or a female servant, he must give 30 shekels of silver to his master, and the bull shall be stoned to death. Okay, so let's kind of unpack what we're looking at here. First of all, if a bull or an ox, this is talking about a massive animal that does farm labor, if it's a bull's first offense, if the bull attacks a human being, the bull's to be stoned to death, but there's no liability for the owner. That is, the owner of the bull does not deserve the death penalty if his animal kind of out of nowhere becomes violent. However, if it's happened before and he lets it happen again, then not only does the bull need to be stoned, but the owner is supposed to be put to death. He is liable for the violent behavior of the bull or ox because he knew about it and he failed to restrain the bull or to put it to death. Now, stoning is the penalty that's first said here. The bull needs to be stoned. The Septuagint translation has, rather than putting it to death, it's put under guard. So if you tie it up really well or pen it up really well so that it can't get out, so that it cannot cause another human death, then you're not liable. Like, as long as there's no other incidents, you're okay. I think this is so interesting. Notice that the owner of the bull can pay a fine, can ransom his life. So although he's guilty of being responsible for the death of a human, and that incurs the death penalty, he can get out of the death penalty if he pays a ransom. Several other things to notice in this paragraph. Note that male and female victims are valued equally. So it doesn't matter if the victim of the bull is a male or female, the same penalty happens. The bull has to be stoned to death. The owner is liable if it's a repeat offense. The owner must take responsibility for his animal. That it's his job to make sure that his neighbors are safe. Really, this whole passage, this whole section of the Mishpatim is about love of neighbor. What does it mean to look out for our neighbor? What does it mean to make sure that others can be safe around us and our property? Then it goes into some subcategories. What if the victim is a child? That is, if it's a son or a daughter, what happens then? And it says same penalty pertains to children. So this is telling us children are not valued less than adults. If a bull kills a child, that bull needs to be put to death. If it's a repeat offense, there's the death penalty for the owner. What if the victim is a servant? Same thing. Being a servant doesn't make it a lesser offense. The death penalty still pertains if it's a repeat offense from a bull that kills a servant. However, if it's a servant, there's an additional fine that you have to pay in addition to the same penalties, because that servant was in the process, presumably, of paying off a debt to the master. So the one responsible for the death of that servant has to pay 30 shekels of silver to repay the lost labor that was owned by the master. Now, there's an interesting comment here about not eating the meat of the bull. And I can think of several possible reasons why this may be in place. First of all, if you ate the meat of this violent bull, you would be benefiting from tragedy. You would be having a massive feast. It's not like they can preserve the meat for a long time. So it would be like a community feast at the expense of the life of whoever died. So it's possible that it's just like out of sync with the mood of the moment. Second, the meat of violent homicidal animals may have been thought to be contagious in some way. We don't want to ingest in our bodies the meat of an animal that was homicidal because we don't want to become like that animal. We want to separate ourselves from it. Third possibility is that it's not to be eaten because the bull is stoned to death, and then that would make it the equivalent of torn flesh, which is off limits for eating. I want to point out that there are steeper penalties to these scenarios in the Bible than there are in other ancient Near Eastern law codes. God deeply values human life, and he holds owners responsible for the life and livelihood of their neighbors. I can remember back 26 years ago, when my husband and I were first married. We were living in an apartment complex, and one day we were out in the common yard area. Our niece was playing outside, and we were watching her, and a neighbor came over and struck up a conversation. And when he found out that we were studying at the local Bible school, he said, I wish there was a .com Bible. I wish there was a Bible that had relevance to the kinds of issues and questions that are coming up today. Because there's no internet talked about in the Bible, and there's no, it's not addressing us and our concerns. And I said, I had just been reading for one of my classes about these laws. I'd been reading the laws about the goring ox or bull. And I said, last night when I was watching the news, I saw a story about a pit bull that had attacked and mauled a child, disfigured a child. And the worst part about that story is that it was the second time this pit bull had done this to a human being. And the Bible sets parameters about the liability and responsibility of owners for their animals, for the animals that belong to them. So if we were to go biblical on this, we would say that owner is responsible for mauling the child because he did not keep the dog penned up, or because he did not put that dog to death. After the dog attacked the first person, biblical wisdom would say that dog has lost its right to live, and it's not safe to have it anymore. And so that owner should be held liable. I'm not advocating the death penalty for that owner. The dog didn't kill someone, but the injury of another person should be taken with utmost seriousness. And we had a rich conversation about the relevance of biblical law for life today if we just read it in its context and consider the claims that it is making. I hope this was interesting and helpful to you. Come back next week and we'll tackle another paragraph. Have a great week.